Mornings in Back Bay always carry the scent of warm wood and butter from the early opening bakeries. From the third-floor window of my clinic, I could see the trees lining Commonwealth Avenue changing into their autumn coats, golden leaves unfurling like a walkway made of sunlight. October in Boston has a gentle chill crisp, but not cruel, just enough to make people pull their collars up, yet still linger a moment longer on their balconies to hear the church bells from Copley Square echo through the air. I set my cappuccino light foam aside and flipped to the last page of my appointment book. The name written in bold fountain pen ink, Kevin Young. Beneath it, my own note court mandated impulse control, confidentiality priority. On the gray sofa, the back cushion still bore that faint, silvery imprint where patients tended to press their fingers when trying to calm themselves. I measured time by the ticking of the wall clock 9:58. 2 minutes to 10. In 2 minutes, the man whose name was both distant and familiar to the financial world would walk into my office like so many before him, carrying his own story and fear and standing at some fragile edge. Think he'll show Dr. Alan Pierce poked his head through the doorway, voice low enough not to disturb the hallway's calm. The salt-and-pepper-haired man had a way of making everything seem less intimidating with a half-joking tone. His name's in the book, I smiled. People rarely skip their first appointment. Except billionaires. Alan winked and returned to his office with a mug of mint tea. I was left alone with the ticking clock and the light spilling across my desk. 10:59. I straightened the consent forms, adjusted the tissue box, and rolled my pen between my fingers. The window's reflection showed my composure hair, neatly tied brown eyes, steady, at least steady enough to convince. This job teaches you to greet every face as if it's the first with quiet respect. Whether they wear shoes polished sufficiently to pay my rent for a quarter, or sneakers frayed at the seams, whether they come for obsession for loss, or for a dry legal order. 10 number. A single firm knock. Come in, I said. The man who entered made me understand why people say some walk into a room as if they've bent its axis. Tall, broad-shouldered, tailored navy suit, fitting like intention itself, shoes unblemished by dust. But it wasn't the wealth that drew attention. Boston had seen plenty of that. It was how he looked, eyes scanning every detail like a running algorithm, collecting, sorting, eliminating. The abstract painting on the wall, the snake plant near the door, the faint scratch on the chair arm. Everything in his gaze mattered. "You're Dr. Rodriguez." His voice wasn't loud, but that cedarwood timbre resonated in the chest more than in the ear. As he spoke, I caught the faintest trace of cologne, the kind that lingers only after an embrace that wouldn't happen here. "I'm Victoria." I nodded. "Please have a seat." He didn't sit immediately. People rarely do when they want to retain some control eyes, making a short lap around the room, fingertips grazing the chair back, before lowering themselves as if granting permission. But Kevin Young didn't perform. He glanced at the window, and the painting then sat precisely at an angle that allowed him to observe me without much movement. "Before we begin," I said, touching the consent form a few formalities. "Everything discussed here is confidential under Massachusetts state law, and I'm familiar," he interrupted, tilting his head. "My team already sent over the paperwork. I prefer to hear it directly from the patient." I smiled, pen still uncapped. "Commitment isn't always on paper." His mouth twitched, less a smile than a small stamp of acknowledgement. "Fair enough." We sat in silence for a heartbeat. It's not awkward, but it's more like the moment before an arrow is released. I began, as I always did, with the most straightforward question. "What do you hope to gain from these sessions?" "Results." The answer came instantly. "I don't have much time." "I do." I peeled a sticky note, wrote the results, and slipped it into his file. "What does results mean to you?" "Quantifiable." He exhaled shortly. Fewer outbursts, fewer reactions that feel like wasted energy. "What kind of reactions?" "The kind that makes people think I'm angry." He paused. "I'm not. I just can't tolerate inconsistency." I nodded, letting the words settle. Can't tolerate inconsistency. In his world, inconsistency meant vulnerability. In mine, it was where people stepped out of their armor. I was about to jot another note when something unexpected happened. He pulled out a checkbook, signed a blank check, and laid it lightly on the glass table. "If commitment helps you work better," he said. "This is commitment." I looked at the check, the way one looks at a bird that's landed on the sill. Beautiful, startling out of place. The numbers in the corner could pay my clinic rent for a year, replace the worn sofa, and finally buy that coffee machine that didn't cough every morning. The room brightened not from money, but from the sudden clarity of a test presented too politely. I said evenly that some people use money to measure their patience. Money measures many things. He replied so calmly I couldn't tell if it was humility or pride. In here, I said, pinching the check between two fingers, it measures exactly one thing: our ability not to use it. I tore it. Not out of drama, not to perform ethics. Return the paper to pulp and the air to balance. The faint rip was almost tender. The shredded white-blue fragments fluttered and settled like a scattered cloud across the glass. Kevin didn't blink, but I saw his pupils contract, reflexive, like a man used to watching valuable things vanish without flinching. I felt a thin prick run down my spine. Not fear, just awareness, like standing before a machine so well-oiled. You know, it could crush you if you misplaced a finger. I said I don't take gifts or guarantees, laying the pen down. Let's start with something simpler, a story, an event. A moment when you realized you needed more control. He leaned back, fingers interlaced, forming a small bridge. I waited, listening to the trolley clatter outside, and my pulse steady. There was a moment, he said finally. 3 weeks ago, a seaport interview. The reporter asked a loaded question, misinformed, maybe malicious. I looked into the camera and told him to find another job if he couldn't do his homework. My PR team spent 48 hours putting out the fire. I wasn't angry about that. I was furious that I'd given someone the match. Where do you think the power lies? I asked. The one asking or the one answering? He smiled faintly. Power usually belongs to the one who decides when to answer. I noted it down. Control by timing, precise, deliberate. Tell me more about smaller moments, I suggested. Not scandals. Everyday ones: airport lines, late emails, missed calls. A late email means a 600 a.m. meeting invite, he said. Airport lines, we have priority lanes. Missed calls. I don't call back. Why not? If they need me, they'll try again. He paused. I don't chase. I set my pen down. I don't chase a defense mechanism and a creed those in power wait. But sometimes waiting is just disguised exhaustion. I was about to say that when I noticed the faint scratch across his right hand, running diagonally over the thumb joint like a stray pencil mark. A billionaire's hand that had once opened something by himself, not just a company. You have a scar, I said softly. Old, but still there. He glanced at it, then up again. It reminds me of where I started. Where's that silence? 2 seconds. This wasn't tension, it was memory pressing against a locked door. I'll tell you, he said, voice unexpectedly gentle. But not today. I nodded. Stories choose their own time to be told. Then today I asked, circling back, how you feel when someone doesn't do what you expect. Like you just did. His lips curved, this time closer to absolute amusement. It's interesting. Slightly irritating. Irritating because of the check. Irritating because now I have to update the model in my head. He folded his hands, leaning forward, eyes alight like a man discovering a new variable in a solved equation. You're not what I was told. What were you told? That you were soft. And now? Now I think, he said slowly, you're soft like a pillow with steel inside. I smiled, not denying it. A pillow with steel might sound wrong in physics, but perfectly right in psychology softness, to let truth rest steel to stay grounded. I glanced at the clock, the minute hand just past 10. 40 minutes gone as quickly as a walk around the block. That's all for today. I closed my notebook. If you'd like to continue, same time next Thursday, 10 sharp. I'll be here at 10, he said. Not 7 minutes late again. Why is it late today? I stopped by the Charles River, he replied without blinking, as if rehearsed. There was a duck swimming against the wind. I wanted to see if it would change course, and did it know. It just slowed down. We walked to the door. I opened it. He stepped through, then paused. Light from the hallway spilled in like a white ribbon. Victoria. It was the first time he said my name. Not as an assertion, but as if placing a small stone by the water's edge. Thank you for tearing it. I tilted my head. And thank you for placing it. He nodded. The door clicked shut behind him, soft like a secret closing itself. I exhaled. The shredded check still lay across the glass, its edges catching the sunlight. I gathered the pieces into my palm and dropped them into the recycling bin, a resting place for things that might have become something else. Outside, the church bells rang again. I looked at the schedule and saw the 10 Howder slot next Thursday, which was still blank, waiting for the name Kevin Young to be written again. Some encounters announce themselves from the very first minute that the story ahead will refuse straight lines. There will be turns where the listener and speaker trade roles. That's somewhere between control and surrender wealth and quiet words that can be measured, and silences that cannot something begins. If you're curious where that duck finally swam, and whether Kevin swam with it or against, see you in part 2. 3 days after our first session, Boston was drenched again. The kind of rain that fell in thin, whispering threads, quiet enough that only a few clear droplets clung to the glass. I arrived at the clinic earlier than usual, brewed coffee, rearranged patient files, and tried not to think too much about the man named Kevin Young. I tried because our conversation had felt like a half-open drawer since that morning. Just one accidental touch, and it would slide out again, gleaming faintly like the check I had torn apart. I didn't regret what I did, but what surprised me was the feeling that lingered afterward: intrigue. Not the professional kind, the kind that belongs to a woman trying to stay rational while something unnamed stirs beneath the surface. When I opened the waiting room door, I stopped short. On the reception table stood a tall, crystal vase, white orchids arranged with deliberate grace. The vase was the cut glass I'd only seen in architectural magazines. Next to it lay a small card. No name, just a line in neat handwriting. Some things are meant to be seen. I didn't need to guess. The scent was faint, elegant, with a shadowy undertone. The same that lingered on his suit that day. Harper, my young receptionist, smiled dreamily. Someone must really admire you, doctor. The delivery guy said it was ordered last night, but no contact number was left. I pressed my lips together, carried the vase into the waiting room, and placed it near the window. If any patient likes it, let them take a few stems home. No point letting it go to waste. Her eyes widened. Are you sure that vase alone costs a month's rent? I'm sure. By noon, an elderly patient named Lila Green asked if she could take a few orchids home. I nodded. Watching her leave with the flowers in her arms, I thought some gifts are only truly beautiful when they belong to no one. Over the next 3 days, more gifts appeared outside my clinic each morning. Monday, a box of Swiss dark chocolates tied with a silver ribbon. Tuesday, 2 tickets to the Symphony Hall front row seats. Wednesday, a leather-bound book. The architecture of silence, no inscription. Not a single note. Yet every item spoke the same language the sender knew me too well. The chocolate wasn't too sweet. The book was one I'd mentioned once years ago in a forgotten interview. And white orchids, the flower that stands for love, kept secret. I brought them all to a patient shelter where the gifts became small joys for others. But even as I tried to clear them away, each object carried something of him intent calculation and a presence that refused to fade. Just as I set my coffee down Thursday afternoon, there was a knock. A woman in her 40s entered gray trenchcoat hair, in a sleek bun, composure so precise it was impossible to tell whether she was an executive assistant or a government agent. I'm Harper Lane, representing Mr. Kevin Young, she said, voice calm but clipped like a command. He'd like to schedule 2 additional private sessions per week. He's willing to pay double your standard fee. I leaned back slightly. Why? He feels the therapy has been beneficial. He'd like to accelerate progress. Therapy isn't an investment, Ms. Lane, I said softly. Acceleration can fracture the structure. Her eyes flickered with something fatigue, maybe even relief. I understand. But he's not used to hearing the word no. Good, I said. Then it's time he learned. For a moment, her shoulders eased as if I'd freed her from a duty she didn't want. Thank you, doctor. I'll let him know. Silence settled back over the room when she left, complete and deliberate. I opened the window to let in the cool air carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt. A strange feeling grew inside me to be tested and watched. The next morning, precisely at 10, Kevin arrived. No flowers, no gifts, just a wet black umbrella, a notebook, and eyes so steady they made it difficult to breathe evenly. "I figured you don't like flowers," he said, resting the umbrella against the wall. "So today I brought a question." "What kind of question?" "Why don't you accept gifts?" "Because I like clear boundaries. What if the gifts aren't meant to cross them only to show gratitude? I haven't done anything worth thanking yet." He gave a short, dry laugh. "You wouldn't understand. I'm used to paying debts in tangible ways. It may be time you tried a different way, such as be on time, tell the truth, stop hiding behind the role of a billionaire." He leaned back, more surprised than offended. "You already know Boston isn't big enough to hide a name like Kevin Young." A faint smile crossed his face, but didn't reach his eyes. "So I've become the latest rumor on Beacon Street. I don't care for rumors," I said. "I care why a man like you needs therapy for emotional control. Because people only believe I'm in control when I pretend to be cold." His voice dropped lower. "But when I'm truly cold, everything around me breaks." I looked at him, the kind of look that meets a truth halfway. His eyes were those of someone who knows exactly how dangerous he is, yet still comes seeking rescue from himself. "Have you ever broken something?" I asked. "Yes. Someone." "Who was she?" Silence. Outside, a train horn moaned faintly, long and distant. When he spoke again, his tone was different. "It doesn't matter. She chose peace. I wasn't allowed to stop." I leaned forward. "You know not stopping can be its own kind of escape. Are you diagnosing me now? Just trying to understand what the man in front of me is afraid of." He looked at me, eyes sharp as cut glass. "Afraid that if I stop, I'll remember what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned the silver ring on his little finger, a small, unconscious repetition of someone holding back words. I opened my notebook, flipping to a blank page. "Let's try something small. Write down one moment when you felt powerless." No details, just truth. He took the pen, rolled it once between his fingers, and bent over the page. His handwriting was firm, slightly slanted, the kind of hand used to sign contracts, not confessions. A minute later, he slid the notebook back to me. On the page were 5 words: "I couldn't save my mother." I looked up, ready to ask, but his gaze stopped me cold. "Doctor," he said quietly, "sometimes the problem isn't controlling anger. It's that I've controlled everything except that memory." A long silence stretched between us. My chest tightened, part empathy, part recognition that we'd just touched the first layer of something much more profound. "And whenever someone mentions kindness, mercy, or sympathy," he continued, "I can't breathe. Because when my mother died, the whole city sent flowers. Everyone was kind, everyone pitied, but no one was there when she needed them." "How old were you?" 8. I fell silent. Outside, rain streaked the glass, merging with the sound of cars on the street. He sat upright, shoulders rigid, as if aware he'd revealed too much. "I don't need pity, doctor," he said softly. "I don't want anyone touching that memory, turning it into a story." "I won't," I replied. "I want you to know it can still be part of you without destroying you." His eyes softened, almost fragile for a second. "You really believe that I do? It's why I do this work." He let out a faint laugh. "Strange. I can buy entire companies with 3 signatures, yet you make me feel like I don't own myself, because owning and understanding are 2 different things." He was quiet, then asked, "If I understand myself enough, will you stop?" "I will," I said. "That's the rule. And if I don't want you to stop?" The words came out softly, but carried a pulse that made the room feel smaller. I set my pen down, keeping my composure. When someone starts thinking they don't want to stop it, usually means they're beginning to feel safe. That's progress. But it's also when we must be careful. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You always phrase things so no one can argue. I only mirror what's already in their minds." Kevin looked up, his gaze now lit with something hard to name, part challenge, part admiration, part danger. "You mirror well, Victoria." So well that I wonder, who's really being treated here? I held my breath for a second, then smiled lightly. We'll find out in a few more sessions. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and his voice steadied again. Same time next Thursday, I don't change my schedule. He walked to the door, paused. If I arrive early next time, will you let me wait? I let everyone wait the same. He nodded as if that answer meant more than it seemed. When the door closed, the room still smelled of rain, wet wood, and something unnamed that lingered in the air. I looked at the words I couldn't save my mother on the page and gently closed the notebook. Some wounds don't need bandages, only courage to face them. But what unsettled me most was the realization that at the very moment he spoke his most actual truth, I began to lose the clear distance of the healer. Outside, the bells from Trinity Church tolled faintly through the rain. I leaned back, closed my eyes. At that moment, I wasn't sure whether I was helping Kevin find calm or if he was quietly teaching my heart to tremble again. In the third week, Boston welcomed fall with a gauzy thread-thin light. Sun filtered through the blinds and glittered across the wooden desk where my coffee still steamed. The clinic smelled of fresh paper fountain ink and a trace of lavender drifting from the ceramic vase by the window. I usually love Thursdays like this, quiet, orderly, unhurried. But this morning, my chest carried a slight imbalance, as if a fine string were pulled taut between reason and something else I wasn't ready to name. Kevin arrived at exactly 10 as promised. Not late, not early, no flowers, no gifts, just him in a charcoal overcoat and a silver wristwatch catching the sun. The way he entered, composed, deliberate, made the space around him fold into a pocket of stillness. "Good morning, doctor," he said, his voice even being low. "Good morning," I replied, gesturing to his usual chair. "Please sit." He slipped off his leather gloves, set them neatly on the table, then fell silent momentarily as if taking my measure. Kevin didn't look like most people. He assessed and examined for hairline fractures. "You seem different today," he said. "How so?" "More guarded." I smiled lightly. "Maybe because I just read an article." He tilted his head. "About me. About Kevin Young, CEO of Young Strategic Holdings, principal investor in the Seaport Redevelopment Boston's so-called Wolf." He let out a small laugh, not surprised so much as ready for this turn. "You looked me up, I didn't. The piece found me. They questioned you, the Hudson Yards merger, the deals that cost hundreds of people their jobs. And I realized, my patient isn't only a man trying to control his impulses." His eyes dimmed, the smile vanished. "And what do you see? I see someone who can direct thousands of people and still can't direct the 8-year-old inside himself." Silence stretched heavier than any defense. "You're dangerous," he said softly. "You turn what people hide into mirrors. But you don't know some things shatter if scrutinized too closely." "I'm not here to scrutinize," I said. "I'm here to look close enough that you can remember you're human." His mouth twitched. "You think I'm not?" "You're used to being viewed as an icon, a strategy, a plan. I only see a man trying to learn how to breathe more slowly." Kevin leaned back, eyes narrowing as if hearing something accurate and inconvenient. "I used to think therapy was useless," he said. "You've changed my mind." "Why? Because you're not trying to make me better, you're making me truer." I froze for a fraction. He wasn't flirting. The weight of his voice did the work, something you want to dodge and touch simultaneously. "And you," I said, "remind me that truth can be scarier than lies." He gave a thin smile. "You don't know the price I've paid to keep it." "I can listen." Kevin went very quiet. Light sliced across his cheek, dividing his face into two halves, one bright, one shadowed. When he spoke, his voice dropped to a near whisper. 24 years ago, my father's construction company, Torres & Young, had a scaffolding collapse on a pier job in Maine. 7 people died, including my mother. The papers called it a technical failure, but the truth is, it happened because my father cut material costs. My chest tightened. He said my father with a kind of strapped-down pain, as if each word had to be pried out with a knife. I was 10. The next day, they replaced the Torres & Young sign with Young Holdings. I kept half the name and dropped Torres his half. From then on, I never trusted anything I couldn't measure. Trust, love, forgiveness. Too vague. I understand, I said softly. You kept what remained as a way to survive. No. He shook his head, eyes cooling. I kept it as a warning, don't become him. The room was so quiet, I could hear the first patter of rain on the street. His feelings were like wind sealed in a glass jar, one tap and it might explode. After a long pause, I said, changing your name was an attempt to erase the past. Now I see you've been punishing yourself with it. He looked at me silent. The sharpness in his gaze had deepened, not hardened. If I stared a second longer, I felt I might fall in. Have you ever wondered, he asked, whether some people are born to carry guilt for others? No one is born for that. But if no one carries it, who saves the rest? No one needs saving. They may only need the courage to admit they can't. Kevin lowered his eyes and laced his fingers. His knuckles blanched, then slowly released. If I tell the truth, will you believe me? That depends on the truth. He looked up, fixing on me. I'm not here because a court ordered me. I'm here because I don't trust anyone but myself. And it's exhausting. A minute of silence. The air thickened as if the room itself waited for my reply. You just did the most challenging part, Kevin, I said. You admitted you're tired. He huffed a soft laugh and shook his head. I didn't know tired until I met you. Do I make you tired? No, he said, voice lowering. You make me want to breathe. I stumbled inwardly. From anyone else, it might have been wordplay. From him, it landed so true that my heart skipped. I hid the tremor by standing to pour water. We should take a short break. He nodded. All right. When I returned, he watched the window where rain had begun to streak into long threads. Do you ever think Boston is sadder than it needs to be? Boston is sad only to people without a reason to stay. And you? I'm still looking. He smiled, gaze drifting. If you found it one day, would you say it out loud? That depends on who's listening. What if it were me? I didn't answer. The question hung, dissolving into the rain. Some silences don't need words. Words would only counterfeit them. We finished at 11:05, later than usual. When he stood, he didn't offer a handshake. He only said, I won't send flowers anymore. Good. But I still want you to accept one thing. I said, not a gift, he cut in. An apology. For everyone who bore the name Young and never learned how to love. I said nothing. In the gray Boston light, his face looked carved out of remorse. Something in his voice pressed against my ribs. After he left, I opened my notebook. Under the date, I wrote one line. Today, Kevin Young told the truth for the first time. I closed the book and turned to the window. Rain fell like fine dust. His black sedan pulled away on the narrow street below, reflecting the pewter sky. I didn't know why, but I felt things would no longer be simple conversations next time. Once cracked open, some doors won't let you pretend they were never touched. A week later, Boston shifted seasons completely. At dawn, fog blanketed the Charles, and the red brick roofs of Beacon Hill glowed with a warmer hue. I kept my routine coffee and old piano record, watching people rush below. But I'd begun to notice something new. I was counting Thursdays. Strange, really, perhaps, because that was the day Kevin came. He was always on time. He'd sit in the same chair, remove his gloves, place them neatly on the table, and spend the first few seconds looking at me. That gaze no longer probed. It searched like someone checking whether any safe corner still existed to hide in. That morning, he looked different. Still in a dark suit, but less precise than usual. Tie, slightly crooked cuff wrinkled, and eyes shadowed as if he hadn't slept. I let him sit for a few quiet minutes before asking. You didn't sleep last night, I asked when the clock hand touched 10:05. He nodded faintly. I was dealing with something. A group of reporters got hold of internal YSH documents, a leak. Do you suspect anyone? No one, he said. I know someone wants me to react the wrong way. He looked up, jaw tightening. They expect me to explode call lawyers and make threats. But here I am. That's the right choice, I said gently. Or is it just what you want me to believe, right? No, Kevin. It's you controlling your anger instead of letting it consume you. That's progress. He gave a dry laugh. Progress won't save a company that's being hit from the inside. I was quiet then, said. Have you ever thought the attacker doesn't have to be someone else? Sometimes it's the part of you that won't let anyone touch what you love. He looked ready to argue, then didn't. The silence that followed was so dense I could feel my breath press against it. 15 minutes later, the intercom buzzed. Harper's voice trembled. "Doctor, there are 2 men here to inspect the HVAC system. They don't have an appointment." "Have them wait," I replied. But before I could say more, a loud crash came from the hallway, something falling glass shattering. I jumped up. Kevin moved instantly, pulling me behind the desk. It all happened in under 10 seconds. The door burst open. A wave of thin white smoke rolled in sharp and stinging. I barely heard Kevin's quick command. "Close your eyes!" He shielded me in the corner, pressing his coat over my face. Outside, hurried footsteps, a faint click. Then the haze began to clear. When I opened my eyes, 3 others pinned 2 men in maintenance suits in black suits. No gunfire, just swift, silent precision, as if rehearsed. A short-haired woman in a black leather jacket stepped in. Her voice was steady, almost clinical. "Report 2 suspects unarmed, using industrial-grade pepper aerosol. Likely testing security response." Kevin still stood before me, hand gripping the chair's arm. "Thank you, Chief Doyle." She nodded, glanced at me briefly. "Apologies, Dr. Rodriguez." YSH received a rather unconventional good morning greeting. Before I could react, Kevin turned to me, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry you had to see that. I didn't think they'd go this far." I steadied my breath. Who are they? People who want to hurt me or destroy me by hurting someone else. I met his eyes. "You said they were testing security. So, they know who I am." He didn't answer. The silence lasted long enough for me to know he knew. They knew. When the police finally left the room, smelled faintly of chemical smoke. Harper brought me a glass of water, her hands shaking. "Doctor, I think you should take a few days off." "I'll be fine, Harper." I smiled, though my pulse still raced. When the door closed, Kevin remained by the desk, his back to me, white streaks of residue still on his jacket. I said softly that I should transfer your sessions to another facility. "It's not safe here." He turned, eyes gone cold. "No, you're not going anywhere." "Kevin, you don't understand." He stepped closer, voice low. "They're not trying to hurt you. They want to see how I react. If you disappear, they'll know you matter." "And do I asked quietly. His gaze softened more than I planned. For a second, I forgot he was a patient. I saw only a man tired, dangerous, disarmingly sincere, standing close enough that distance felt irrelevant. "You need rest," I said, regaining composure. "Let me handle the aftermath. I'll file a report." "No." His tone sharpened. "No police, no press. I'll protect you, Victoria." "I don't need protection, Kevin. I need to know what I'm up against." "You mean who?" He gave a bitter laugh. "Anton Caldwell. Former rival. He doesn't have to kill me, just make me lose control." The name stopped me cold. Anton Caldwell, the head of Orion Capital, was tied to stock manipulation scandals and was investigated but never charged. The finance world called him the man who could break an empire with a whisper. You think he'll stop? No. But this time he chose the wrong angle. He touched you. I drew a long breath. "Kevin, don't turn this into a war. You need therapy, not retaliation." He looked at me half amused, half sad. "I'm not retaliating. I'm defending big difference, doctor." He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "I'm assigning security outside your office for a few days." "Don't argue." "You can't." "I can," he said quietly. "And I already have." The door closed, leaving me in a silence thick with smoke and unease. As I reached home that night, I noticed a black SUV parked across the street. Headlights were off, and the faint YS logo glimmered on its grille. He hadn't lied. Kevin was watching over my world quietly, relentlessly. I made tea and opened my journal. On the same page where he'd written, "I couldn't save my mother," I added a new line. Today he saved again, but by controlling. I closed the notebook. Yet the morning replayed itself in my mind, the haze his arm pulling me down, the warmth behind the wool of his coat. Not fear, but the disorienting comfort of being protected, even for a second. The next morning, the Boston sky cleared. I arrived early at the clinic, bracing for a long day. But as I reached the door, I saw a white envelope in the mailbox. No name, no seal, only one line in black ink. Don't trust him? Inside was a photograph of Kevin and me in session, captured from a ceiling angle sharp enough to see each strand of hair. A chill slid down my spine. I called Harper at once. Her voice trembled. Doctor, the cameras were offline for 10 minutes yesterday. No one knows why. I looked again at the photo. In it, I was calm. Kevin leaned slightly forward, half in light, half in shadow. If someone released this with a suggestive caption, my reputation would evaporate overnight. I sat back, gripping the edge of my desk, a strike without gunfire, precise, silent, aimed straight at my weakest point, trust. And I understood, in Kevin's world, everything was a battlefield. Even emotions. Somehow I had already stepped onto it unarmed. I didn't know what would come next. But one thing was clear: from this day on, every meeting between us would no longer be therapy. It would be a psychological duel between a man learning control and a woman learning not to lose herself to the man she's trying to heal. I spent the whole night thinking about the photograph. Each time I closed my eyes, it reappeared me in my usual posture, light slanting across the desk, and Kevin Young bowing his head, a bare moment suspended between trust and danger. The photo wasn't just proof of an intrusion, but a warning someone is watching us. The next morning, Boston wore a veil of pale mist. I reached the clinic earlier than usual and set a kettle for tea instead of coffee. I needed clarity, not caffeine. When Harper arrived, I asked her to recheck all the cameras, door locks, and record storage. She nodded, her face still tight with worry after last week's pepper smoke incident. At precisely 10, Kevin arrived. No flowers, no smile. His eyes were as deep and still as winter water. He asked just as I set the white envelope on the table between us. He looked but didn't touch, only furrowed his brow. I said, "This was in the mailbox this morning, no name. You should see it." He opened it and was silent for a long time. When he looked up again, the steel brightness in his gaze had darkened. "Caldwell," he said quietly. "It's him. You can't be sure. I know how he plays. He never strikes head on, he makes people doubt themselves." I met his eyes. "And if he succeeds, Kevin? If I lose my license over a single photo, do you plan to send an army of lawyers to tell the ethics board this was just industry tactics?" He lifted his head slowly. "I won't let that happen. You can't control everything. I can try." The words landed like a command. I exhaled, opened my notebook, and wrote a few lines. "I need your signature." "What is it?" "An incident and professional boundaries memorandum. Every session will be documented in tandem with internal oversight from today on." "I have to protect myself, Kevin. And you." He studied the page without speaking. After a beat, he took the pen and signed with a single decisive stroke. The black ink sank in feathering slightly like dried blood. "Thank you," I said softly. His reply came low and steady. "I didn't sign because I trust paperwork, Victoria. I signed because I trust you." My heart skipped a fraction. I kept quiet. Trust is a double-edged blade, especially when it comes from someone used to turning everything into a transaction. The session moved more quietly than usual. No razor-edged questions, no jabs, just measured pauses. I asked. He answered. The conversation drifted unhurried. "Tell me about your mother," I said gently. He sat still, eyes on his fingers as they turned the silver ring. She loved classical music. Every morning she played Chopin's Sonata No. 3. She said music was the only way to make a heartbeat in time with kindness. She was right. The day she died, he went on the little radio at the site was still on. But the melody cut out mid-phrase because of the smoke. I replayed that piece so many times that I memorized where the cracks are. His voice was even, but I saw his hands tightening. It was controlled so fine that anyone else would have mistaken it for calm. "Do you still listen to it?" I asked. "No. I'm afraid I'll want to forgive my father if I do. And I'm not ready. Forgiveness isn't forgetting Kevin." To me, it's a weakness. Or maybe you've never forgiven yourself so you don't believe it exists. He looked up. Something in his eyes made me swallow the rest of the thought, a pain too actual, too private. One more step and we both might fall. Midway through, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his brows drawing tight. I have to take this. I nodded. He stepped into the hall. His voice came back low and quick. I said no more leaks. No lawsuits kill the story first. Use PR, not legal. He returned after a few minutes and set the phone down. His face had cooled. Caldwell is pushing a rumor that I pay to manipulate the press. It's already running. How will you respond? I won't. But there's something I need from you. I looked up. Need you understand public psychology? I want you to analyze how people will likely respond to my image right now. What makes them believe me or hate me? I hesitated. That's outside the scope of therapy. But it's part of who I am. He paused. You said we're working so I can know myself better. This is part of it. He wasn't wrong, but something in his tone pressed past the frame of our work, as if the patient were trying to pull me into his whirlwind. After a beat, I said, All right, but I'll analyze. I won't intervene. He gave a small smile. You're always careful as if you're afraid of losing your footing. I only know how to stand in the middle. I don't. The air in the room seemed to shrink. He held my gaze a moment too long, an almost invisible, delicate, and dangerous tension. I left late that day. A light rain had started. As I parked, my phone vibrated. An unknown number, no name. If you keep seeing him, the images won't stop. I stood still. Raindrops blurred the words on the screen. I took a screenshot, sent it to Harper, and asked her to archive it as evidence. But my head held only one line. Won't stop, which meant they were still watching and wouldn't quit until one of us broke. I didn't sleep. Rain tapped the window like the heartbeat of unease. In the dark, I wondered, am I still his doctor, or have I become a witness to a war no one can win? The next morning, Kevin called. I want to meet, but not at the clinic. Where's Seaport? My office. There's something you need to see. I hesitated, then agreed. I had to face this to know where I stood. Young Strategic Holdings headquarters rose at the water's edge, glass soaring high, mirroring the pale sky and the glittering harbor. His assistant, Harper Lane, met me in the lobby and led me down a long corridor. The elevator opened on the 40th floor. Sea air seemed to press against the windows. Kevin stood by the glass sleeves rolled back to the room. He wasn't looking at the ocean. He was looking at his reflection, an influential and suffocating figure alone. I asked you here because I want you to know everything he said as I approached. I've turned over all internal data to the federal investigators. If I'm charged, the press will loop back to your name. I don't want you dragged in. I understand. No, Victoria, you don't. If I fall, Caldwell will release it all. He won't stop at the photo. He'll come for your reputation. And you think I'm afraid? He turned his gaze slicing through the air. I don't want you to be afraid because of me. Kevin, I said steadily that you can protect a company employees and even your public image. You cannot protect other people's feelings. He stepped closer, the space between us, narrowing to a few handspans. Do you think that of all the things I have, I would let you be the one I lose? My heartbeat stumbled. Each word hit not violently but hard enough to tilt me off center. I drew half a step back. You're crossing a boundary. Maybe, he laughed softly, voice rough. But every time a boundary appears, I want to break it. I looked at him. In those pale gray eyes, I saw my own reflection, small but clear. No longer a doctor. No longer a bystander. I said quietly that you have a meeting with the commission in the morning. I also have to file a complaint with the Medical Ethics Board. You'll report me. I'll tell the truth. And the truth is, I breathed in and met his gaze. That we've gone too far to call each other patient and doctor anymore. Silence stretched, then he gave a thin, almost pained smile. Then, at least in all this chaos, I have one real thing. He turned away, but I knew he wasn't calm. His hand had tightened thumb, rubbing the silver ring, the one habit he still couldn't control. I watched his reflection in the glass, framed by Boston's pale blue sky. For the first time, I realized the most frightening thing wasn't the watcher outside, it was what was taking root inside me. A forbidden feeling so real, I could no longer pretend it wasn't there. Outside, a harbor wind lifted a few strands of his hair. He turned back. Our eyes met in silence. Just a second, but I knew no boundary was thick enough to stop what was coming. Boston woke to a sky so clear, it felt weightless sunlight, thin as tissue, scattering over the Charles like a strand of glitter. I reached the clinic early and opened the windows to let the wind rush in. On my desk, Kevin Young's file lay tucked inside a leather folder, its page corners softened by repeated use. I sat alone staring at the line that read, "Patient currently in emotional therapy and impulse control treatment," and felt it was in a way a gentle lie. Because between us, doctor and patient no longer applies. I kept replaying yesterday afternoon on the 40th floor, the sea breeze tilting the curtains, him standing inside a wash of reflected light saying, "I won't lose you." The words pulsed in my head all night, a second faint, even heartbeat curled beneath my own. So this morning, I knew what I had to do. I wrote a termination of treatment statement. Only one page, but each sentence weighed like metal. I chose every word to comply with the ethics board and still avoid the icy tone of a severance. The treating physician has decided to end treatment with patient Kevin Young to avoid conflicts of interest and preserve professional integrity. This decision takes effect today. I signed and stamped it. I folded the paper, slid it into an envelope, and pressed it flat with the heel of my hand. It felt like pinning down a spasming heartbeat. When he arrived, I didn't greet him with a smile. Kevin noticed the white envelope on the desk and slowed. "What's this termination of treatment?" I said. He stood still for a few seconds, then gave a dry laugh as if I'd told an impractical joke. "Is this a new kind of game?" "No, Kevin. I'm serious. You know that's impossible. I'm still in treatment. We're no longer within the bounds of treatment," I said, my voice roughening. "If we continue, we both lose." He stepped closer. Pale gray eyes flaring with anger. "Lose what? Your license?" "My reputation. Victoria, don't hide the real reason behind tidy excuses. The real thing I'm afraid of," I said, "is myself." Silence filled the room. The window curtains stirred. Somewhere outside, a distant train horn sounded. I stood and held the envelope out to him. "You have the right to choose another physician. I'll transfer your records with your consent." He didn't take it. He just looked at me. "Do you know the worst thing a person can do?" "I'm about to. Make someone believe they're safe. Then pull away when they finally do." I closed my eyes briefly, then said, "I'm not pulling away, Kevin. I'm stopping before we both fall." He smiled, faintly bitterness on his tongue. "You think I'll let you stop that easily? You don't get to keep me with feelings." He took one step close enough that I could hear his breath with what then. "Logic, you're telling me the man who built an empire on instinct, that reason always wins." "Not wins," I said. "Survives." He went quiet. My words had struck something inside him. After a moment, he said quietly, "I read your file." I froze. "What? Not illegally. Harper found an old interview. You worked at the Massachusetts State Psychiatric Hospital, didn't you?" I nodded once. "Your last patient was a former soldier, Elias Moore." He held my gaze. "He took his life after you discharged him." I went rigid. "You have no right to bring that up." "I'm not attacking," he said, voice dropping. "I want you to understand, I know what losing control feels like when someone dies right after you thought they were okay, when you believed too much in reason." I sat lacing my fingers. I've lived with that guilt for 6 years. And that's precisely why I can't let this happen again. "This," he asked. "You mean us?" "Yes." Kevin studied me for a long time. I didn't look away. We stood at opposite ends of a taut string pull any tighter and it would snap, let go, and we'd both drop. At last he exhaled, voice gone hoarse. "If I accept stopping, will you disappear from my life?" "I won't disappear," I said, "but I won't be your doctor. And if I don't want you as my doctor, but as the woman I love?" I trembled not at the words, but at how he said them. No raised voice, no theatrics, just a truth stripped and ruthless. You don't know what you're saying, Kevin. I do. I've never said it to anyone. But if I have to choose between losing the person who makes me want to be better and keeping my spotless reputation, I prefer the first. My chest tightened. I meant to argue, but fear and tenderness clogged my throat. Do you realize your feelings could be dependency? I asked. When people are learning control, they often mistake care for salvation. And you, he murmured, have you considered that you might need saving too? The question emptied the air from my lungs. I turned my face away from his. We ended the session in silence. When he left, I didn't watch him go. But I knew he lingered outside the door for a few minutes. Before he truly walked away, that evening an email arrived from the Medical Ethics Board. They acknowledged receipt of my self-report. Dr. Rodriguez has acted according to guidelines by recusing herself from a potential conflict of interest case. I read the line again and again, but relief didn't come. Because I knew what I'd just severed wasn't merely a course of treatment. 2 days later, a message from Harper, Mr. Young, will be in Europe for 10 days on business. He sends his regards and his thanks. I replied with a single word. Noted. But that night, standing on the porch, wind threading through the maples, with a faint hint of salt from somewhere far off, I realized something in me was still waiting. Not a message, not a call, but the steadiness I lost the moment I met him. 10 days later, Kevin returned to Boston. No warning. I was gathering paperwork when a knock sounded. I looked up there. He was black suit, white shirt, and an expression I couldn't name. I thought you were in Paris. I was supposed to be, he said, but I don't like places where you aren't. You shouldn't be here, Kevin. I filed my report. From now on, I can't meet you in any therapeutic capacity. Then we'll meet as ordinary people, he said, calm in an almost frightening way. No doctor, no patient. Just a man and a woman. It's not that simple. It isn't, he agreed. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. He set another envelope on the desk, identical to the one I'd given him. This is a copy of the amended agreement. I've terminated my official patient status with your center. From now on, we're both free. I looked at the paper, then at him. In that instant, I knew he had won not in power, but forcing me to face myself. As he reached the door, I called softly, Kevin. He turned. I don't know what happens next, but you have to promise me one thing. What? Please don't use me as a weapon against your past. He watched me for a long moment, then nodded slightly. I won't promise, but I'll try. The door closed. His footsteps receded. I stood in the still room, my heart beating faster than the clock. On the desk, 2 white envelopes lay side by side, his and mine. One to cut, one to begin. And I realized that sometimes to be chosen truly, you have to step forward first. Stepping forward doesn't mean you've escaped. You're brave enough to admit you're walking into something that has never had a name. Early winter in Boston brings a peculiar cold, not sharp enough to make you curl in on yourself, but just enough for your breath to turn to mist in the air. I sat in a small cafe by the Longfellow Bridge, looking out at the Charles, under a skin of pale fog. It had been over a week since I ended therapy with Kevin Young, and over a week since we last spoke. And yet, in every motion of the city, I still saw him in the figure of a man adjusting his collar before a high window in the wind, sliding past glass towers. Even in the lights skimming the water, cold and keen as his eyes. Once the boundary was cut, I'd be free. But freedom can be a delicate captivity where you're no longer bound by rules, only by memory. I kept working, seeing patients and asking the familiar questions. Have you been sleeping? How are your feelings today? But each time I spoke, I heard myself asking him, the man who once made me believe empathy could become a wound. On Thursday afternoon, just as I was about to leave, Harper called Doctor. Someone sent you a package. No name left at reception. I went downstairs. Amid the files and mail, a small brown wooden box was unwrapped and tied with a thin black ribbon. Inside was a vintage cassette player, a Philips 1979, and a single cassette. The handwritten label read, Chopin, Sonata No. 3. My chest tightened. The piece he had told me about the last thing his mother heard before she died. I looked around, but no one knew who sent it. Harper said a courier had dropped it off, but no details were left behind. I took the box home. That night, when everything was quiet, I slid the tape in. The sound was grainy aged. The piano rose trembling like a memory surfacing from deep water. Midway through the second movement, I realized there was a voice. Not Chopin. A man's voice, low and hoarse, threaded between the music. If you're hearing this, it means I did what you asked. Stopped. I won't call, text, or look for you. But don't think I've vanished. Because everything you do has touched me in a way no one else ever has. I went still. The room seemed to freeze. I used to think control was strength. You made me see that sometimes control is just another way to hide fear. Thank you, Victoria. Even if we're not on the same side anymore, I owe you a piece I never knew. Then the music continued quiet as a goodbye. I switched it off and sat for a long time in the dark. What rose in me wasn't exactly pain nor pity. It felt like staring into a mirror with a crack. The image remains, but you can't touch it without bleeding. 3 days later, Boston Financial News ran a front-page headline, "Kevin Young resigns as CEO of Young Strategic Holdings." Stock drops 18% overnight. I read the article in a state that was part confusion, part fear. He had truly stopped, not just with me, but with the world he used to control. At the hospital lunch meeting, colleagues murmured, "He's crazy. Who walks away from an empire like that?" I said nothing, because I knew that sometimes people aren't crazy. They're simply learning how to live for the first time. I stood at the window that night looking toward Seaport, where Young Holdings glowed like a strip of isolated stars. I remembered his words. I don't like places where you aren't. And I realized that perhaps he was keeping that promise when he left it all. A week passed. I began to get used to the emptiness. But emptiness stared at long enough takes the shape of the person who once stood there. On Saturday afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. It's me, Harper Lane. Her voice was steady but low. I know I shouldn't call, but Mr. Young, there's been an accident. I froze. Where is he? Mount Auburn Hospital. His car was hit on the Longfellow Bridge early this morning. No life-threatening injuries, mild head trauma. He won't let us contact family. He said, if anything happens, tell me. I didn't think. I ran. Outside, the sky was the color of pewter. Cold wind swept along Memorial Drive. When I reached the hospital, Harper was waiting in a private room on the 6th floor. I went in, my palms ice cold. Kevin lay on his side, a white bandage around his forehead, shallow scrapes along his wrist. And still he was himself, the calm of someone accustomed to loss. He opened his eyes when I spoke. His voice was rough. You came. What happened? Nothing serious. I missed the worst of it and hit the window a thin smile. You didn't think I'd die that easily. Please don't say it like that. I'm not joking. When the car spun, I thought of you. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of dying. I was worried you'd never know I'd truly changed. I sat on the edge of the bed. You should rest. You still haven't forgiven me, have you? Forgive you for what? For pulling you into my world. He breathed out. I know I made you part of my war. But believe me, Victoria, whatever I did wrong, selfish, was for one thing, I didn't want you to vanish from my life like my mother did. I lowered my head. His voice thinned as if each word cost him something. I want someone to stay, not for reputation, not for gain, for me. I looked at his hand on the sheet, thinner, paler than before. I reached out, hesitated, then held it. You do have someone who's staying, Kevin. He squeezed my hand lightly, eyes closing. You have no idea what that means. Maybe I do, I said, my voice a confession. A nurse came to check on him. I stepped back to the window. Outside, the Longfellow Bridge still glittered with lights. Traffic streamed as if no one had nearly died that morning. I looked at him, the man who once held everything, now reduced to quiet and a fresh scar. And something had changed. In his fragility, he seemed more human than ever. When the nurse left, he whispered so softly I had to bend close. When I'm discharged, I'll go, I promise. Go anywhere that won't make you worry, and you think I won't. He gave a faint laugh. You shouldn't. But I will. He opened his eyes and looked at me. Not an invitation, not power, but surrender. I don't want your pity. It isn't pity, I said. I just can't pretend I never knew you. We looked at each other and said nothing more. Some things, if spoken, would ruin the moment, and this was one of them. I left the hospital after dark. Snow had begun to fall quietly, laying a thin veil over the city. As I drove across the Longfellow Bridge, I saw the hospital lights fading to a single fragile thread in the rear view. I knew that tomorrow, everything would be different. But whatever the road ahead held, I would carry the image of this night, the so-called Wolf of Boston, lying silent beneath white snow, and me who once believed reason could keep me safe, learning how to love without a cause. Because sometimes love doesn't come to save you. It shows you that even the scratches on a mirror can still catch the light. 3 weeks after the accident, Boston had sunk fully into winter. Bare trees along Commonwealth Avenue wore a thin coat of snow, and the wind from the Charles carried a trace of salt within the cold. The city looked like a white painting, still beautiful but fragile. I hadn't seen Kevin since he left the hospital. He kept his promise, no calls, no messages, no flowers, no signs of coming back. Only one thing, he couldn't control his presence in my mind. Each morning crossing the Longfellow Bridge. I remembered that snowy day, the reflection of hospital lights on my windshield, his words. I'll go so you won't have to worry. I thought I'd been ready for that. But maybe no one is ever ready for the absence of someone who once made them feel alive. That day, Harper came to my office. She wore a cream turtleneck, her face calmer than usual. Mr. Young has transferred most of his assets into a community fund, she said, sitting down. He no longer holds an executive role at YSH. You should know. I nodded quietly. Is he all right? Harper smiled faintly, a mix of surprise and tenderness in his own way. He's at a seaside house now, the one that used to belong to his mother. He says he wants to start over. I stayed silent. In my mind appeared the image of a small house by the Maine coast, wind sweeping over dunes, waves breaking against rock. The picture was so beautiful it hurt. He asked me to give you this. Harper placed a gray envelope on my desk. It wasn't heavy, but when I picked it up, it felt like holding a chapter that hadn't quite closed. I didn't open it right away. Only after she left did I slide my finger under the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter, slanted neat, painfully familiar. Victoria, I don't know if writing to you is a childish way of facing silence, but I know there are things I'd never say aloud if I didn't write them. I've started over not with work, but with myself. I'm learning to stand without winning, to exist without control. Every morning I make coffee and play that old Chopin record. I still can't finish the piece, but at least I don't stop it after the first few bars. You once told me forgiving isn't forgetting. I understand now. I haven't forgotten my father or my mistakes, but I've learned to look at them without hating who I was. You probably still think I'm dangerous, but the truth is I was at my most dangerous when I'd never known what it meant to be afraid of losing someone. Now I am so scared, Victoria. And strangely, that fear makes me feel alive. If you pass through Maine one day, stop by the house by the sea. The door isn't locked. I don't know if I'll be there, but a cup of coffee will always be on the table, Shunkei. I folded the letter and set it down. To someone else, it might have read as goodbye. But I knew it was an invitation light as breath, yet deep as a tide. The days that followed passed quietly. I treated a new patient, a young student with chronic anxiety. When she said I'm afraid I'll never get better, I suddenly heard my voice from months ago. I told her, sometimes to get better, you must stop trying so hard. Breathe and give your pain a place to rest. She smiled softly, calmer. When she left, I stood still for a while and realized perhaps I was finally beginning to heal the same way. On Sunday evening, I decided to drive out of the city. No calls, no messages, just the road. The highway from Boston to the Maine coast stretched for 2 quiet hours, but I didn't feel tired. The farther I went, the saltier the air, the clearer the sky. Small yellow lights lined the path when I turned onto a narrow dirt road. Then I saw a warm but straightforward wooden house by the sea, its windows glowing like a soft invitation. I stepped out and walked up the porch. The door was exactly as he'd said, unlocked. The scent of coffee lingered. On a small wooden table by the window, 2 cups steamed gently. And he was there, standing on the porch, gray sweater, wind-tossed hair, a faint but genuine smile. "I knew you'd come," he said, voice roughened. "I wasn't sure. I've never been sure of anything until now." We looked at each other. No word could name that moment where every wall built by reason dissolved in a glance. I stepped closer. He said nothing, but his eyes said everything. Maybe we both understood it wasn't about beginning again, but seeing what remained after everything else had fallen away. "I don't know how long I can stay," I murmured. "As long as you want. We're not signing contracts this time." His line made me laugh for the first time in weeks, and maybe that was when I knew all my defenses had already fallen. We talked through the night not about what had happened, but about small things, the dishes he was learning to cook. The painting his mother once hung the book I'd left half-read. There are no roles or boundaries, just 2 people sitting together in a small house in winter. Around 3 in the morning, he asked quietly, "Do you ever feel like you're one of the cracks?" "What do you mean?" "The cracks in a mirror don't reflect everything, but they let the light through in a more beautiful way." I looked at him and nodded. "That could be how the broken ones survive." He smiled. "You're always right, even when you're not trying." "I'm not trying anymore," I said. "I want to be here." He didn't answer. He just reached out with his hand. I placed mine in his, no trembling, just warmth and calm. Dawn broke. Light spilled through the curtains, brushing across his face. I realized then that some people don't have to belong to each other to be whole. It's enough to breathe in the same quiet. I stepped onto the porch and drew a deep breath. The sea wind stung but softly. Behind me, he called Victoria. I turned. He stood framed in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand, smiling peacefully. This time he said, "Don't run. We've got nothing left to lose." I walked toward him. "No," I said. "We've just learned how to hold on without hurting." He looked at me for a long time, then placed a cup in my hand. Amid the warmth and the salt of the sea breeze, I knew everything had finally found its place. Not an ending, but the silence between 2 breaths where the heart no longer hides and a person finally stops being afraid of what they feel. Winter in Maine had its own kind of light, neither bright nor sharp, but thick and slow soft, like the breath of someone half asleep. When I opened my eyes each morning, I saw that light filtering through the sheer white curtains, draping the little house by the sea in a silver haze. Kevin always woke before me. He had a habit of walking along the sand before sunrise, bringing back 2 cups of hot coffee from a small cafe a few blocks away. When I stepped out onto the porch, he would already be there, hands in the pockets of his gray sweater keys fixed on the waves crawling onto the shore. "You still take it with little sugar, right?" he asked, his voice roughened by the cold wind. "I do." He smiled faintly and set the cup beside me. No words were needed. That simple gesture made the morning feel in order again. We'd been living together for 3 weeks. No declarations, no promises. Everything unfolded naturally, as if we had never been apart. But in the gentle silences between us, something lingered like a small flame caught in the sea breeze, never quite dying, never quite burning free. One afternoon, Kevin took me to a cliff where he said his mother used to stand to take photographs. The sky had turned a muted gray, and the first snowflakes began to fall. He pointed out toward the horizon. She used to say the winter sea was the only thing that never betrayed her. It changes color, changes mood, but never pretends to be calm. I followed his gaze and asked quietly, "And you, Kevin, are you pretending to be calm?" He didn't answer right away. His smile was soft but off-center. "I'm learning to stop fighting myself." "What about you? Still trying to stay as smooth as glass?" I let out a small laugh. "The mirror's already cracked, Kevin." "I'm trying not to break it further." He turned toward me, his eyes gentling. "If it shatters, I'll be the one to pick up the pieces." "And you think you won't get hurt?" "I've lived my whole life with wounds," he said. "A few more won't matter." The words tightened something in my chest, not out of pity, but because I knew he meant them. Kevin Young. The man who once owned half the Boston skyline now held only the fragile pieces of peace he was trying to keep together with both hands. I stepped closer, brushing my fingers against his. You don't have to hold it together anymore, Kevin. No one's watching here. He lightly squeezed my hand and murmured, "Don't leave again, Victoria. At least not until I've learned how to stay still." That night, the sea roared. Wind battered the porch, and doors trembled on their hinges. I couldn't sleep. Kevin was still awake, sitting by the fireplace, the flames painting uneven light across his face. I just called Harper, and he said when I entered, "YSH is under investigation again. They asked me to come back. I refused. I thought you'd already walked away, so did I." He rested his elbows on his knees, staring into the fire. But letting go of something you built, sometimes it's more complicated than letting go of a person. I sat beside him. "Because you still feel responsible." He shook his head. "No, because I'm afraid. Afraid that without it, I'm no one." I stayed quiet. His shadow stretched across the wall, a man caught between light and dark, unsure which side to choose. I said softly that you can still be yourself, even without the things that once defined you. You have to walk through the emptiness first. He turned toward me, eyes searching, torn between reason and a fragile faith. "And if I don't dare to walk through it, then I'll walk with you as long as you don't give up halfway." It wasn't a promise, it wasn't a confession. But when I said it, I knew I had already chosen to stay even in the uncertainty. In the days that followed, Kevin began to write. He filled notebooks with reflections. Old projects, wrong decisions, unsent memos. I didn't ask what he planned to do with them. I brought him coffee each morning and left the notebook on the table. Sometimes I found him staring at the ocean for hours. One afternoon, I glanced over his shoulder and saw a few lines on the page I used to think success meant others bowed to me. Now I know it's when someone can look at me without fear. I knew those words were for me, but I said nothing. Some gratitude doesn't need to be spoken, only lived. By the 4th week, the snow had thickened. One afternoon, I went out for groceries while he stayed home. When I returned, I saw him standing at the cliff's edge, his dark sweater stark against the white snow. I ran to him. "Kevin, the wind's strong. What are you doing out here?" He turned a faint smile on his lips. "Do you remember when you told me that sometimes people must stop trying not to hurt?" "I remember. So this is what it feels like." He placed a hand over his chest. "I'm not afraid anymore, Victoria, not of losing remembering or being weak." I stood still. I saw him truly at peace for the first time, not because he was in control, but because he had let go. We returned home at dusk. Inside, the golden lamplight reflected off the window glass. Kevin boiled water, poured tea, set a cup before me, and said quietly, "Tomorrow I'm going back to Boston." I looked at my chest tightening. "You're sure?" "Yes." He smiled. "I need to finish that road myself." You once told me I couldn't keep hiding in the past. Now I understand. I didn't stop him. Because love, when it's real, isn't about keeping someone, it's about letting them go when they're ready. That night, we sat side by side in silence. Outside, snow fell endlessly, covering every path. The fire crackled softly. I rested my head on his shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "Victoria," he said, voice low, "I don't know what the future holds. But if one day you pass through Boston and see the light still on in the 40th floor office, know that I'm thinking of you." I smiled faintly. "You don't have to promise me anything." "It's not a promise," he replied. "Just a signal so you'll know that a light hasn't gone out somewhere." The next morning he left. The black car disappeared down the snow-lined road. I stood on the porch, fingers wrapped around the coffee cup he'd left behind. The wind bit at my face, but I didn't feel cold. On the table, his notebook remained open. On the final page was a single line. "Thank you for not saving me. If you had, I would never have learned how to stand alone." I closed the book, left it where it was, and looked at the sea rising under the morning sun. Light pierced the mist, glimmering on the water like broken shards of glass. And I knew whether that light on the 40th floor burned or dimmed between him and me, there would always remain another kind of light. The kind born between two people who had walked through darkness together and still dared to smile when they saw each other from afar. Sometimes that alone is its own kind of love. 3 months after the trip to Maine, Boston welcomed summer with crystal clear mornings. The Charles shimmered like a mirror reflecting the pale blue sky and kayaks gliding slowly across the water. Every morning, I still walked Ava to school over the Longfellow Bridge, stopped at the cafe on the corner of Beacon for a light foam cappuccino, and still looked east toward where the sunrise used to begin. The world seemed to have returned to normal. But inside me, there was a space not big enough to be called pain, yet not small enough to forget. On my desk at the hospital, I still kept the postcard Kevin sent from Florence. The slanted script and the black ink were slightly smudged. Beneath it, he had written, "If one day you see a man on the shore with a camera, don't rush away, because it might be me learning to capture the things I can't keep." I read that line so many times I knew it by heart. Not because I wished for his return, but because I sensed something profoundly true in it, like the last light of sunset flickering on the water, brief but unforgettable. As I finished my shift that afternoon, Harper appeared at my door. She wore a pale blue dress, her face brighter than before. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said, "someone sent you a package from Italy." I paused. "Italy?" "Yes. No name, only a Florence return address." "I thought you'd want it." I signed for it, my hands slightly unsteady. A small box neatly wrapped in brown paper. I opened it. Inside was an old camera, a Leica, and a folded note. "You once said the scariest thing about memory is that it can't be photographed. So this is how I'm learning to keep the things I don't dare lose. There are a few photos in the camera. You can look or not. But if you do know this, each was taken while I was thinking of you. K." I switched the camera on. The shutter whispered. The screen lit up. The first image was the Maine coast. At dawn, the sun just lifting off the water. The second was a steaming cup of coffee on a wooden table. The third is a notebook open to the last page with the line I once wrote, "Don't use me as a weapon against your past." And the last photo was me, standing on the porch in a gray sweater, head slightly tilted, the wind lifting my hair. He had photographed me without my knowing. I didn't cry. I only felt a warm current spreading from my chest outward, as if someone had touched my heart lightly but truly. I sat alone in my apartment that evening, looking out at the city. The 40th floor light at YSH was still on. Not bright, just a quiet gold, the kind of light kept by someone working or waiting for a return. I didn't know whether he was there, but I knew that part of him remained here in the music I played each morning, the coffee he used to make, and the silence where I had once found myself. I wrote back briefly. "Kevin, thank you for the photos." I looked at them. Each one holds a space, and I think it's meant for me or you. I'm still working, still taking my coffee with little sugar, still bad at keeping quiet when my heart stirs. But I learned one thing from you sometimes. Love isn't holding on. It's letting someone be free to find the better version of themselves. If we meet again, I hope it won't be as saviors, but as two people who've learned to forgive themselves. V. I folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope. But instead of mailing it, I left it on the table between the postcard and the camera like the final chapter of a book I wasn't quite ready to close. The hospital hosted a medical symposium at the Copley Square Hotel a week later. I was invited to speak about the impact of empathy in psychotherapy. The conference hall glowed rows of chairs in clean lines. I stood at the podium and spoke as calmly as I could. Sometimes I said what a patient needs isn't advice, but the presence of someone steady enough to dare face their fear. Among the hundreds of faces, I suddenly saw a familiar figure in the back row. Black suit, silver tie eyes, as steady as on that first morning in my office. Kevin. He didn't speak, just nodded slightly when our eyes met. A small acknowledgement, but enough to tell me he truly had come back not as a patient, but as someone who had learned to stand in life without hiding. After the session, I stepped outside. Boston's afternoon light was honey soft. He leaned against the railing, paper cup in hand. "I thought you might not recognize me." He smiled. "People don't easily forget what once made them afraid." "Were you afraid of me? I was more afraid of myself." He looked at me, his gaze deep but no longer cold. "And now it's different. Now I feel peace." He nodded, silent for a moment. "You know I didn't come back to start over. I came back to say thank you. Thank me for teaching me that love isn't possession. How else could someone like me who tried to control the world learn to let go if not because of you? I smiled. You don't need to thank me. We're simply two people who learned the same lesson from opposite sides. He studied me, then spoke gently. One last question. If I asked you for coffee today, not as a patient, not as history, just as a man who wants to talk with the woman he once loved, would you say yes? I paused for a few seconds, then answered. If you promise it won't be too sweet. He laughed. I remember you taking a little sugar, and I remember you never used to finish your cup. Maybe I'll try this time. We walked down Newberry Street past small bookshops and the stone bridge where our footsteps once lingered. We didn't mention the past because we both knew that some things are most beautiful when kept quiet. Evening fell. Sunlight slanted across the rooftops. The wind carried the smell of pastries from the corner bakery. Kevin stopped and looked at me. Do you believe he asked that after everything people who once hurt each other can still smile when they meet again? I don't believe it, I said, but I just watched it happen. He smiled. You win again. I didn't win, I said softly. I was forgiven by myself. When we parted at the corner, he said I won't say goodbye. I've learned that sometimes the ones who matter don't need promises. They only need to trust that a light will be waiting wherever they go. I watched him walk away tall against the crowd until he disappeared. Above Boston, the sun was setting, bathing the city in warm gold. I exhaled, feeling like I'd returned all the old things to the wind. That night, I went home, set the camera on the table, and looked into its tiny viewfinder. In that small mirror, I saw a different woman, still me, but gentler, calmer, as if every wound had finally found a place to heal. I turned on the lamp, opened the window, and played Chopin's Sonata No. 3 again for the first time in months. The piano rang out clear and whole, no more breaks. I closed my eyes. In that moment, I saw a picture him standing by the C camera in hand, turning back to smile at me. No promises, no bindings. Just two people who had once lost each other, and were now brave enough to go on living in their own worlds, yet facing the same dawn. The next morning, Boston's sunrise was astonishingly bright. I took the camera with me and walked across the Longfellow Bridge. Sunlight spilled over the water, glittering like words left unsaid. I raised the camera and clicked. My first photograph in a long time, not because I wanted to hold on to anything, but because I knew I was ready to begin. And in that instant, I could almost hear a voice carried on the wind. In the end, we can still capture memories. I smiled. My story with Kevin Young didn't close with a perfect ending, but with a quiet peace, where love is no longer a game of power, but a gentle reminder that even after losing each other, people can still find their way back to themselves. If you've stayed with this story to the end, tell me, do you believe in the final quiet? Leave a comment and share how you feel, because sometimes the hearts that have broken understand best what it means to love with calm. And if you've lost someone, don't be afraid to begin again. The dawn still returns. The only question is whether you'll open your eyes to meet it.